Professor Howard Williams takes you on a journey through time and space, exploring death and memory, past and present. Archaeodeath.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to another Archaeodeath interview, and I'm super excited to be in conversation with someone who I've known for many years, but I haven't actually sat down and had a proper natter with before, so this is exciting for me, and I'd like to introduce Hannah, or would Hannah like to introduce herself? Welcome, Hannah.
Yeah, I'm yeah, we have known each other, I think, because of all things teaching and learning for a long time. So I am a professor of archaeology and pedagogy at the University of Manchester, which basically means I'm a professor of archaeology and teaching and learning of archaeology. And I'm sort of more broadly involved in teaching and learning at my institution. So I'm the university's academic lead for academic development, but we can leave that out of the discussion probably. But I do all sorts of bits and bobs around teaching and learning, both within archaeology and without. That's a hopefully that's an all right summary.
Well, that's fantastic because, yes, you're working within the discipline, but way beyond for your university across disciplines and nationally and internationally as well, because you've been hosting all these, these discussions of teaching learning in the UK, but also in conversation around the world. But I'd love to touch on at least some of that. But that's a great way of introducing yourself and where you are now. And you're newly inaugurated as of yesterday. And I hope it all went well.
Yeah, it was really nice. I was made professor in 2021, but it was in the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of the lockdown, and it was sort of that point where it was, it didn't feel right to be sort of going woohoo because terrible things were happening. Actually, it's been quite good. So my school, my administrative area that I sit in at the university, have stopped doing the inaugurals during the lockdown, and I think that's a really good thing because it's a nice thing to do to celebrate with people and everything. And actually it's just given me a bit of time for it to sort of sink in as well, and to sort of think about what it means and things. And so and I've been on sabbatical this year as well, so I've had a sort of time to sort of think about how to articulate things. So it was a very nice thing to do, but also I was very grateful to have a little bit of time to sort of think about it as well.
So it's all been for the better that you've had that delay. So you're not newly professored, you are newly inaugurated with that time to run. And that's fantastic. So how did you get into archaeology, Hannah? How did you become you, in particular, this passion for both the teaching and the research?
So I mean, I think everyone who's an archaeologist has a when I was a child, this thing happened story, right? I think that's pretty much the law. So when I was about 7 years old, there was they were going to build a housing estate sort of quite near to my house. There was lots of sort of complaints about it. It was before all the planning legislation was brought in, which dates me. But it was before all the planning legislation was brought in, so there wasn't a systematic way to protect any archaeology in advance of development. But some archaeologists, I don't know who they were or where they came from, they came in and they dug a big trench, and I lived near where there'd been lots of Roman things, and so I think they were hoping they might find some Roman stuff, and they didn't find anything, which was a shame. But I was about 7 years old, and I was very inspired, and then I went back to my garden, and in my garden I found a piece of I did some digging in my garden. I found a piece of pottery, and I took it back to them and said, I found this in my garden. And these kind, wonderful archaeologists said, oh, we'll leave it with us and we'll analyze it. Come back in a couple of days. So I came back in a couple of days, and they put it in a bag, and they said, oh yes, now we call this granny pottery. That's what they said. And I was like, this is a special technical term. It was so obviously like some like late 1900s willow ware type thing. That's what it was. But it was so lovely, and I was always into that kind of thing. Read lots of books, like kind of Penelope Lively books and things that were about going back in time, and went to lots of sites with my family. I was so lucky with all of that. But I thought that what I wanted to do was be in English and be what I really wanted to do was stage management in the theatre. That's what I really wanted to do. And then when I got my A-level results, they were sort of better than I expected. And I'd done history, geography and English. And my English teacher very kindly said to me, if you want to write and you want to do stuff for theatre, you don't have to do that as your job. You can do that for pleasure alongside other things. I think maybe she was politely telling me that wasn't the career for me. And I went home and I said to I can see myself so vividly saying to my mum, but what would I do? I mean, what would I do? And my mum said, well, you love history and you love geography. And I think, doesn't archaeology bring those together? And it was like, I don't know why I'd never thought of it, because I loved it so much. And it's thanks to both those lovely archaeologists when I was 7 and my mum when I was 17 or 18, making both of those suggestions that has made me an archaeologist. But in terms of teaching and learning, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Edinburgh, and then I came down to Manchester to do my PhD. And I was really interested in the Mesolithic Neolithic transition, and that's what my PhD was about. At the same time, in the first decade of the 2000s, the government had set up the Higher Education Academy, which was a quasi-autonomous something, non-governmental organisation, or
that's
something
right.
like
You got it right.
Yeah.
Yes. I couldn't have done that.
So it was a sort of arm's length thing, but it was there to sort of support teaching and learning in higher education. And it had these subject centres that meant that there could be dedicated support for teaching and learning. And at Manchester, the person who was leading the archaeology part of the History Classics and Archaeology Subject Centre was Thomas Dowson. And so, yes, and he, and Karina Croucher, who you've spoken to as well. So Karina and I were doing our PhDs at the same time, and Karina ended up sort of doing lots of work. When she finished her PhD, she became the person that effectively was managing the part of the archaeology subject centre, archaeology part of the History Classics and Archaeology Subject Centre. And she and Thomas sort of drew me into doing some research, or not drew me into, asked me if I wanted to join them in doing some research about the role of fieldwork in the archaeology degree. And I was only reminiscing about it in the inaugural yesterday. It was amazing, because we basically went to every single excavation that was happening in the UK with a university in the summers of 2004 and 2005. And we spoke to students on every single excavation, and we asked them the same set of questions, about sort of what their experiences were, what they were thinking, what they think about careers, how did they connect fieldwork in the classroom. And we had these amazing conversations with so many students, and got to visit so many amazing excavations. It was the sort of dream project, and for me that was a real catalyst in thinking about the relationship between how we teach and learn archaeology and how we teach field practice. And at the same time, I was starting my excavation project, which has now been running for 18 years on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula in Western Scotland. And that was very much that I direct that with Ollie Harris at Leicester and Phil Richardson at Archaeology Scotland. And we were all early in our careers, and we were sort of thinking about how we'd wanted to be taught archaeology. And so being part of the HEA's Archaeology Subject Centre and that piece of study, and running my own project, and being so close to having been a student and thinking about how I wanted to teach that, all of those things kind of coalesced. And then when I finished my PhD, the position I got at Manchester was in teaching all of our fieldwork. So that's kind of how my journey has sort of gone. I've been thinking now for 20 years about how we teach archaeology, but particularly how we teach the real sharp end of archaeology, the actual sort of digging in the field, and how we then connect that back to the classroom and make all of those things kind of connect up. That is a really long-winded answer. I'm so sorry, Howard.
No, you've taken me on the full journey and sort of taken us into the next area I was going to talk about, was how your ongoing themes in your research, and you've kind of already encapsulated that really well. And I wanted to sort of talk about that pedagogic side a little bit more. Perhaps the most pressing question for me is, do you feel in the time you've been doing field work and teaching yourself, obviously the subject is changing, our ideas are changing, our approach is changing, but do you feel the way we're teaching has changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's lots of things that have changed. So the broader context of archaeology has changed, I think. So even, if you think 20 years ago, archaeology and the rise in archaeology degrees, and universities offering archaeology degrees, that had really just happened. It was the 1990s where we got all the legislation about planning that sort of led to that boom of archaeology in the commercial sector, and the boom of archaeology happening in universities, and stimulated by amazing things like Time Team and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think we were still quite new. There were still lots of university archaeology units. So at the University of Manchester, we had a unit. Now I think there's only 4 universities in the UK that have an archaeology unit attached to them. But at that time, I think most universities either had a unit attached, or that were doing archaeology, either had a unit attached or worked very, very closely with sort of smaller local companies. And I think that kind of broader context has changed. We don't have as many university archaeology departments, archaeology units, and we don't have as many smaller units either, because they've sort of all coalesced into sort of big entities. So small regional offices have become part of regional offices of larger entities and things like that. So that kind of context has changed, and therefore our needs as a profession of what we want from students has changed, but also what our students want has changed as well, because of the rise in fees. And because of things like fees, our higher education systems have changed. I think there's much more accountability to students in terms of what we're providing for them, and in terms of meeting needs for diverse learners. And so in many ways, I think we probably teach quite similar. Our techniques have changed. We've had this explosion in things like DNA and digital methodologies and things like that. So those things have changed. But in many ways, I think we still, the sort of heart of teaching archaeology, we still go and dig, we still teach our students to dig, but it's the things around it that have changed, the people who are doing it, the reasons for doing it. So I think students are often a lot more there's a real sort of difference between some students come in really vocationally driven, I'm going to be an archaeologist, and some students are thinking, it's going to give me loads of amazing critical skills, loads of broad thinking, it's going to give me all sorts of transferable skills, I'll do it and I'll see what happens. And so we've got that kind of real mix. And so I think it's all of the moving parts around archaeology that have changed more than how we teach it itself. And those have then had an impact on how we have to teach. That's a bit of a long-winded answer.
I mean, yes. I mean, we're in a changing university world. We could rant about that a lot, but in terms of the subject, I think that's true. And I feel throughout my career, I've always been proud of when I feel I've almost accidentally sometimes, and sometimes by design, found myself ahead and innovative, and other times I'm quite, I'm quite nervous about when I realise I'm not up to speed with things. And I think we're always learning as teachers and developing. And I certainly know as my module feedback slowly declines, as expectations rise, and I'm not as young, and there's a dynamic there. I think personally my teaching is a lot better and been improved by practice, but also adapting to different circumstances. But I mean, you never get anything right, but you never, I also see how things are changing, and trying to go, that's a rubbish idea, that's a rubbish, oh, that's a good idea, I'll try that, and seeing how things work. And each year is a bit of an experiment. And I don't know if that's something that people talk a lot about generally. I haven't really talked about anyone about that, but each year you do the same thing again and again to a degree, because you're building on what you've taught before and what's worked. But we're always adapting, aren't we?
Oh gosh, yeah. And I think that's so I think one of the biggest changes for British archaeology, for teaching British archaeology, was that in 2010 the higher education academies subject centres all closed down, and that was because of sort of the austerity measures that came in, and the shift in funding and everything. And the higher education academy itself sort of changed function and became Advance HE, which is much more about kind of accrediting people's teaching and learning, and making sure that sort of people are teaching right and sharing good practice across higher education in a much less subject focused way. And I think from an archaeology perspective, I personally really felt that loss of not having the subject centre, which was a space to try and to experiment, and to exactly as you say, to share failures, to say I tried this method and it didn't really work out, I don't know why it didn't work out, and to sort of actually play those things through with other people who really get it. And like I go to a lot of teaching and learning conferences that are not archaeology ones. Those are just people across higher education, and having that space actually with those colleagues to talk through why things worked and didn't work makes me realize how much we miss that. And so I think Karina and I sort of grumbled about it for about a decade, and then during the lockdown, the first lockdown, we were supposed to be running a session at the Theoretical Archaeology Group conference in America in April 2020 or May 2020. And obviously that didn't happen because we'd gone into lockdown. And we used Zoom and sort of created a teaching and learning roundtable. And it worked really well. Like we invited all the people who were supposed to be in the session. We all sat down and we sort of talked about teaching and learning and things. And in that move in the pandemic where everyone was having to sort of skill up very quickly into sort of digital teaching and learning, it was we recognized that was really useful. So we had a few of those, and then we were like, oh, well, maybe we should just make this a proper thing. So since then we've run 27 round tables, and we've got a whole sort of schedule more to come, and we ran the first ever teaching and learning in archaeology conference, like a global conference. But the lovely thing about that is that bringing back that space to A, to talk about your teaching and learning, and B, to talk about why didn't this work, why did this work, and to have that space to share, I think is so important for us. And I think, like, if anything, in terms of how that things have changed for archaeology, not having that space to share was I think a real sort of problem, at the same time as we're getting all that kind of scrutiny from universities in a way that we didn't of sort of student satisfaction and quality assurance and stuff. The two things sort of bring you into tension. You need to be able to kind of talk about that with people. So no, I know exactly what you mean, and I think it's so important having those kind of spaces to be able to talk it through.
So what are you, is there anything else about the teaching side we should perhaps tackle before I want to delve into some of your research interests? So, because your teaching is your research as well. So that's what people need to understand, is that you've done a book about articles about field work and teaching more generally. Is there anything more you want to talk about that before we look at the research into the human past, so to speak, if you like?
Yeah, I suppose, to segue neatly between them. So for me, the place where I have been able to bring those two research interests, both in how we teach and learn and in the human past, together, has been the Ardnamurchan Transitions project, which is project that, that's the excavation project that I direct with Ollie Harris and Phil Richardson, and on the west coast of Scotland. And I think I said, we started it when we were quite early in our careers, and it's been really wonderful because Phil and Ollie and I have all been interested in those kind of how we do field archaeology. And so we were all initially working, well, after our PhDs, working in the commercial space, or, well, Phil and Ollie were, and I'd come from the commercial sector, and we were all sort of thinking a lot about the kind of brilliant work that was happening around how you hear diggers' voices. So all of Paul Everill's brilliant work about the invisible digger, we were really conscious of all of that, and the various different methods, things like the Stone Worlds work by Chris Tilley and Sue Hamilton and Barbara Bender, and things like the framework archaeology, which was Heathrow Terminal 5, was it, when they built that?
Yeah, that's it.
And that was an amazing sort of these were various sort of interpretive big field projects that aimed to kind of foreground the voice of the digger, so that the interpretive process was interpretation at the trowel's edge, as Ian Hodder's paper is famously named. And so we were really interested in how we bring that into the space where we're teaching students. How do we get students' voices at the trowel's edge? So we were digging and interested in the human past, but also interested in the processes in which we did that. So that's kind of hopefully a kind of helpful segue into those. So
the Ardnamurchan project has been experimenting with new ways of recording or of capturing interpretations in the field. For all of those 18 years, have you built a sort of something different from what inspired you at first, or are you sort of still playing with it? I don't know. How's it going?
Oh no, we're totally still playing with it. So yes, so we've been using for a long time some context sheets, which are partly inspired by things like Rebecca Yamin's work at 5 Points, where she encouraged all the people on her digging team to write these kind of interpretive vignettes and these kind of interpretive narratives. So our context sheets I've got all the core things that a context sheet needs, but it also has all sorts of sections to ask people to think, what's the story, to look up from that context and to think about that kind of broader way in which that context came to being and what the stories are behind it. And also what we've tried to do with our context sheets, I know this is such a challenge, because I think when you write a context sheet, when you're digging, you go, oh, I need to dig this thing and understand it. And then you sit down and record it. We've made a box where you record at the start, the middle and the end. So you can see that kind of changing thought process. And I think, like, well, hold up my hands up to say that sometimes that does not work, because sometimes it's raining and you don't want to get all the context sheets out, or it's super windy, or you need to show someone something, or you don't recognize that it's a new context until all of those kind of things. But all of those contingencies mean that those kind of things are also captured in a way that often our archaeological processes kind of sterilize that thinking. And so we've sort of captured that. But also we started off having these things that we called participant forms, and we asked people initially every day, and then after a while every 3 days, to sort of reflect on what they were learning, what materials they were learning with, to really ground it in the kind of material dimensions of things. And I think participant forms are probably the thing that we've then experimented with trying to make in a digital way. And I think, once you get off site, you want to be able to relax. And I think that's been the most challenging thing to keep up with. And then in recent years, we've been looking at starting to record digitally, like having digital context sheets. And that's where I think we're really experimenting with that at the moment, because I think actually that process of sitting down and writing with someone, writing a context and talking about it and having a conversation, if instead you've got drop down boxes, it shuts down those kind of conversations. So we're sort of trying to think about how we can both have that digital expediency of so no one has to scan in or type up any context sheets, and so that you can build matrices really easily, but also keep that interpretive dimension in. So that's kind of yes. So the answer is, its short answer is yes, we've continued to experiment, and I think the longer answer is certainly thinking about how we move into a digital world, but keep those kind of interpretive methods in place is really important.
It's a challenge, isn't it, of the tech, of Wi-Fi or mobile signal, of weather conditions. You'd think, well, wet paper is no good, but then many other things are no good. My phone, trying to get it to take a photograph with a fingerprint, a key lock or whatever you call it, is a nightmare. Just in the same way as so. Yeah, it's about not. I've seen many an archaeologist over the year advocate digital. It's going to transform. Yes, but you've still got all challenges of the logistics and the physicality of writing with a pen, or the dexterous nature, is that the word? I don't know, whatever the phrase is something very different, isn't it? You don't want to just shut down things with, as you say, tick boxes. And
totally. I love Colleen Morgan at York and the Aid Memoir project that they did, where they were looking at things like drawing in the field, and how now we can get the GPS and we can go bing 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 around a feature and we don't have to plan it, but the process of sitting down and thinking about it and looking at those dimensions is a really important interpretive process. And when we draw it, we capture something that we don't capture in the digital. And for teaching, that's really important, because I think you can record stuff really fast, but if you want students to understand those kind of processes, and if we want to interrogate the interpretive processes, keeping a dimension of that is really, really important in all of those different ways. So yeah, it's really interesting how both thinking about field practice and then thinking about teaching and teaching field practice, and thinking about what we need and what we actually have to sort of provide, and tell Highland Council we've got here's this data. Thinking about how all of those intersect is a really interesting challenge, and keeping on top of all of that. It's great. It's really fun to think about.
And what you dig, so you're dealing with here a multi-period landscape of features from as early as the Neolithic or even earlier. Mesolithic, right
Yeah,
up to the 19th, 20th century. So
yeah,
how does that inform that mix? How does the nature of the archaeology sort of it help with that or challenge that process?
yeah. No, it's really interesting. Yeah. We initially went to Ardnamurchan. It's Ardnamurchan is, I don't know if you're, I don't have you ever been there? It's such a lovely
No, I
place.
confess not.
Oh, it is. It's so nice. I shouldn't say it in public because otherwise loads of people will go. No, loads of people should go. It is lovely. So it's the most westerly part of the UK mainland, and so it's attached to the mainland, but to all intents and purposes, it's got an island feeling, and it's actually harder to access than an island because with the islands on the west coast, there's the fantastic ferry services. But
Yes.
the Ardnamurchan Peninsula has one road, which is a single track road, and it takes about 2 hours to drive 30 miles from one end of the peninsula to the other. So it's really quite a sort of remote place. And up until the 1950s, people were navigating it with boats. They had drovers tracks over the across the peninsula, but they didn't really introduce sort of proper paved roads. It only has one. It has one road across the peninsula, and then a couple of sort of smaller roads that go off to smaller townsheads. And they were only introduced sort of really relatively recently. So it's amazingly remote, and because it's got a really sort of varied geology and really varied landscape, so it hasn't had deep plough farming, so the preservation archaeologically is incredible. So we went to the north coast of the peninsula in 2006 because there was a chambered tomb there which had been surveyed by Audrey Henschel, so a Neolithic chambered tomb, so about 6,000 years old. It had been surveyed by Audrey Henschel, who was a formidable woman who basically surveyed all of the chambered tombs of Scotland before we had all the amazing digital surveying techniques, and wrote two sort of volumes of it. And Clad Andrus, she categorized as her the first tomb in Argyll and Bute in that area. It's actually in the Highland region. And she said, oh, well, she talked about the kind of type of chamber tomb it was, but she had seen when she was surveying it shells coming out of a rabbit hole in the side of the tomb. And at the time, in that part of the kind of early 2000s, we were having a lot of conversations across the discipline about whether there was continuity between the last hunter-gatherer Mesolithic sites and the first farming sites, and whether how that process of transition happened, and whether so in the Mesolithic there is hardly any human remains from Britain, a very small amount, and the human remains that we do have come from shell middens on the west coast of Scotland, so massive big shell heaps got human bones in them. And the preservation conditions mean excellent preservation of the human remains. And there was a couple of Neolithic chamber tombs where they'd found shells in them, and there was a discussion about whether this was a continuity of practice, that these big monumental Mesolithic shell middens, whether then the same principles of monumentality of having a fixed place to dispose of the dead or process dead bodies became sort of what people did at Neolithic chambered tombs. And Clad Andrus, this Neolithic tomb in Sordal Bay that we went to, we wanted to investigate whether this was the case. It's a scheduled monument, so we had permission. We didn't have permission to excavate within the scheduled area, but for the first few years of the dig, but we excavated outside of the scheduled area, and that was really cool because then we found all sorts of things. So the tomb was actually surrounded by a ditch, the front part of it was surrounded by a ditch, which is quite unusual. There's only two. There's Maze Howe and Bryn Keffley V are the two that I know of that had a ditch around them. There might be others. Add that caveat quickly.
But they're the main ones.
So there's ditch and various different things. When we got scheduled monument consent, we were able to excavate the sort of forecourt of the tomb and look at all the kind of amazing things that were going on. So they weren't putting in human bodies whole into this Neolithic chamber tomb, very classic Neolithic action. They were taking parts of bodies that had probably been weathered elsewhere in the landscape, bundling those parts of bodies up, sometimes with also parts of animal bodies, and then pushing them into the chamber, and they doing that again and again and again. So it really fantastic to find that and that evidence. And actually our excavations showed there was no Mesolithic shell midden underneath Clad Andrus. The
Okay.
reason that there was shells was because Cladangerous was built onto the raised beach. So the west coast of Scotland has had really huge fluctuations in sea level. And so at the point where this was built, it was basically sand dunes. It was built onto the dunes, onto the back of the beach. So the very first thing that happened there, 3,750 BC, is the radiocarbon date we have, is that there was a cremation that was sort of placed literally into the sand, and then a circular tomb was built on top of it, and then with the chamber, and then they changed the shape of it and it became trapezoidal over time. So really amazing sort of, we think about these kind of monuments as being these kind of fixed singular things, but our work at Cladangerous shows that it's been sort of tinkered with through time and sort of changed and adapted through time. And the really cool thing is that that has happened all the way through time. So in the Neolithic it changed shape and things like that. But then at the very end of the Neolithic, the start of the Bronze Age, it was sort of blocked up, and then a Bronze Age curb cairn was built right up. It was built right up against Cladangerous, pretty much abutting it, with a kist in the middle with two bodies in the kist. And then, so this is Bronze Age now, we're looking at about 1800 BC, 1850 BC. With amazing Whitby jet beads from a spacer plate necklace, only individual ones, and analysis has shown that they were worn, they were really well worn. So these must have been on people's bodies through generations and then passed down into the grave, and they were put in this kist in sort of specific places. So amazing things, and that's just abutting the tomb. We've got another kist that's probably Bronze Age, but had probably been robbed further down, just outside of the scheduled area. And then amazingly, across this landscape, as we've walked and field walked and done geophysics and test pitted, we found other Bronze Age activity, including another Bronze Age cremation, a Bronze Age cremation that has almost exactly the same radiocarbon date, but sort of just further inland from that, and within structures, within a series of post-built structures. So we've got amazing stuff at the tomb, but also probably something that may have been I wouldn't go as crazy as saying a Bronze Age funerary landscape, because we've only got a few bits and bobs, but Bronze Age people were depositing their dead in all sorts of different ways, both as inhumations and cremations across this landscape. So that's really absolutely amazing. And I can't remember why I've got on to saying about all of this, Howard, but I can just carry on telling you about all the pyramids and stuff we've
it's
found.
about the synergy, how the archaeology is relating to your practice, and you're finding you're finding, you're asking questions, you're finding things you didn't expect. Archaeology is all about finding what you don't expect and building that picture, and the students are participating in that, different forms of recording. And it goes through up to the Viking period. He does.
Oh my God! Do it goes beyond in many ways, but so there's all the amazing Bronze Age stuff. The other known site that's in our study area, so when we first started, there was Cladangerous, the Neolithic chamber tomb, and then an Iron Age promontory fort.
Yes.
And so we excavated that as well, which is fabulous. I think fort as a defensive term, it's not helpful. Loads of people have written about that. So it's this kind of almost spine of land that sticks out into the sea. And we found activity, Iron Age activity, all the way sort of along it that must have sort of controlled the way people moved through that space. And then a large building and large amounts of burning right on the end, with metalwork and burnishing stones and things like that, which is really exciting. But we know in the Iron Age that they were doing that at on Dunvercaith, on this promontory fort, but they were also having a bit of a footle around at Cladangerous. So the ditch was recut in the Iron Age. The ditch around the tomb was recut in the Iron Age. There's an Iron Age hearth in front of the tomb, so we know that they were also there and sort of looking at it and probably amending it and thinking about it. And then into the early medieval period, we excavated a tomb, a cairn that was on the side of the hill. And we said to our students, "Oh, we found this, we found it in the survey. We think this looks prehistoric." And it did look really prehistoric. And the radiocarbon dates came back, and it was it was a cremation, and it was, I think, 7th or 8th century AD, so it was early medieval cremation in basically a almost sort of Bronze Age looking stone cairn.
As they should be. Yes, good.
Yeah,
Yes,
it was really cool. But so we've got that, which was really amazing and wonderful to work through with the students, because we were so confident, oh, this is definitely prehistoric, and then the radiocarbon dates just, you know, changed that narrative. So it was so amazing to sort of do that. And then back at Cladangris, well, about 100 meters from Cladangris, we have the only Viking boat burial from the UK mainland. So that's probably about sort of 10th century. So a completely different burial practice to the cremation, sort of about 300 years apart. And that Viking boat burial obviously was really amazing preservation. Not of the human remains, although we got 2 teeth and we know so much from those teeth. But the material culture was incredible, like a sword and an axe and all of those kind of things. But the really cool thing is that when we were excavating Cladangris, we also found a Viking bead in a disturbed context in the chamber of the Neolithic tomb. So we know that the Vikings were also having a bit of a footle around in this Neolithic tomb. But unfortunately, then there was subsequent quite significant Victorian damage to the chamber, and that meant that we've really lost any kind of stratigraphic evidence of Viking intervention apart from the bead that was present. But yeah, so really just really amazing things.
The biography of the landscape is these monuments don't disappear, people go back, reactivate them, re-engage with them, and also you've got this, you know, a long story that takes you through time, and it's those people understand, you know, when you're in those landscapes, you appreciate it more, that those things interact. But perhaps when telling the story, it's more challenging, isn't it, to try and explain that, you know, these different, you know, arbitrary phases we block up time into are in conversation with each other as the landscape changes through time.
And I think that's where, like, the students come in as well, because bringing the students into that conversation and recognizing that we're part of that story. Cladangris is this amazing sort of messy temporal assemblage of all sorts of things happening at all different times, drawing them in, and us as well, we're there too. And so sort of building us in as part of that story, and our interventions as not being this kind of clinical sort of scientific thing, but being quite emotionally drawn to what's going on there, and to this sort of rich landscape and those kind of ideas of those sort of multiple intersecting temporalities is really lovely. So we try and express that to our students as well, and sort of encourage them to think about their sort of part within it all. So that's where the archaeology and the sort of multiple dimensions of things that have happened over time really sort of mix with the students who we're training on the excavation.
And of course, themes that are close to my interests of death and memory are central to this. But of course, you're acutely aware this landscape is settled too. People aren't just coming there for, which is why I just for the audience benefit, that's why you sort of, as I'm often reluctant to do, to talk about funerary landscapes. This is often just more visible elements of a whole routines of practice, but we still have specific challenges of interpretation with that data. I mean, is there any other strands to your work that has a funerary or deathly element? I know it's only part of a broader landscape project, but you've talked about the chamber tombs and the Viking boat grave, which is pretty famous in itself, but these are elements of a landscape story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, do you mean in terms of Ardnamurchan or beyond?
Or more generally, really? Because I know you've got interest in Mesolithic death, and you've also got interest in Neolithic Bronze Age. You know, there's times when we don't have evidence of the funerary record too, of course. You know.
Yeah, and I find that really interesting. Yesterday in my inaugural lecture, my co-director Oliver Harris didn't have to say was the distinguished speaker and said nice things about me, which was very lovely. But one of the things that he pointed out very explicitly was that I live my research by enacting it at all times. So one of the things that I was really interested in my doctoral research and still fascinates me about the Mesolithic is how much, as you say, like, you can't pick out a funerary landscape, and in the Mesolithic people were obviously constructing their personal identity, their personhood through all sorts of different sort of bringing together bits of materials and releasing bits of materials into the world. And you know, it's likely that we don't have many human remains because bodies were being broken up and separated and put out into the world in a way that's very different to the sort of subsequent periods. And I think sort of the kind of tools that people are using represent parts of landscapes. They're bringing those landscapes with them from place to place, and maybe, you know, tools can be sort of sticky with the resonances of the people who've used them and the places who've used them and the lives that have been lived. And that way, you know, a tool, you know, a tiny microlith can be so much more than just, you know, whatever sort of functional tool it was there for, and can represent or be part of persons. And I think that's something that I've always been really interested with. And so Ollie was made the point that I also distribute my personhood across the landscape, because I'm always leaving bits and bobs of things everywhere, and that I get on the site with a toolbox neatly in the morning, and by lunchtime everything, all the trowels and bits are everywhere, and all across the world. So yes, I think I've been influenced by thinking about the Mesolithic and bodies and landscapes in that kind of way.
But it's so, you know, if I was going to crudely characterize what you said back at you, and you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong, it's not that you're saying that death and the dead and bodies of the dead were not important in the Mesolithic, but we're potentially looking at very different understandings of what is a person in life and death, and how objects, places interact with these people. So it's not that they don't recognize mortality and have funerary procedures, but that, you know, that relative invisibility of the dead is neither disregard nor accident. It's part of a broader way of thinking about being in the world. Or is that a
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's a much better way of saying
no, I'm just not my thing. I'm just trying to get my head around these things, you know.
But I think so, and I think, you know, just because it's invisible to us, you know, 9,000 years later or whatever, it doesn't mean that that bodies and mortuary practices and death were invisible to the sort of people who were practicing that way in that period. And I think it's really interesting to think about those kind of relationships where sort of, you know, perhaps death was all around people in a way that it still is today, and that was sort of materially manifested in very different ways.
I mean, it brings me back to an earlier conversation I was having with Professor Karina Croucher in a previous interview, where, of course, in her chats with modern people in cafe type scenarios or in workshop type scenarios, she's showing classic iconic pictures of the archaeology of death, be it, I don't want to mischaracterize, but say bog bodies, pyramids, you know. But we can do so much. Almost everything to do with archaeology has a deathly or mortality element to it. And so whether you're dealing with collections of hazelnuts or other, or it can be, just a piece of clothing, it still can be really important in connecting those people to who owned it before, the stories connected to those objects. And I was trying to, I've got a bit of a viral drama going on social media about the new discovery of two mid 18th century glass bottles containing late 18th century cherries that have been discovered at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. And people are going absolutely bananas at me in the comments for making the obvious point that, as other historians on social media have, that, and archaeologists too, why aren't we emphasizing that this is all the product of the work of enslaved people, and that this is therefore, when the meaning we give these discoveries, these archaeological good news discoveries of, exciting, well-preserved finds, those cherries or the fragments of them are about enslaved lives and their experience, and that not that those individuals were identifying with those cherries and going, I'm really proud of these cherries. No, that the opposite, actually. Those that will be consuming them are not those that are actually managing the trees, collecting them, transporting them, storing them. But whether it's that or it's Mesolithic traces, we're the entanglement of people's lives and experiences with that material world is the way we access the dead, and how those people dealt with their story as it was unfolding. I mean, I think that's so important, and it's not just about grand tombs and well preserved bog bodies that can allow us to do that. It's through that understanding of landscape and lived past traces. I think so in many ways I'm telling myself off for focusing on death and bodies, but I think it's so important to do that kind of broader work. Anyway, I rant.
No, I totally understand, and I think Karina's work is a fantastic example where actually sort of in the sort of global north and the modern west, we've really sort of alienated ourselves from talking about death, and yet, like you say, it is still all around us. It is quite normalized. Like you might scatter ashes at places, and then you go to those places and you remember that person, and we're probably talking about really similar stuff in the Mesolithic, and that kind of that kind of practice, talking about it and normalizing it in the present, helps us to think, I think, so much more in the past in a sort of really sort of connected way. So no, absolutely.
May I shift to another topic, and that is that you are the latest author to join a sort of almost an institution in itself, the production of the 6th edition of Archaeology and Introduction. Originally, was it 1983? Kevin Green originally, and then it became Green and Moore, or was it Moore and Green? And now it
Green
is
and Moore. Yep.
And
now it's Cobb, Green and Moore.
Cobb, Green and Moore. So congratulations on this. And I have to confess, and this is something I would talk to you about before, but I want to say on air, so to speak, is that, while I've used textbooks all my career from being a student myself, it's only and I obviously share them and I critically evaluate them. It's only in really the last year that I've been worrying about them, thinking about them in a more in-depth way of what do they do, what stories they tell for people not only who are students but also potentially want one book or two books to learn about archaeology and may grab them. And so congratulations for this coming out, because I think it's so important. We shouldn't be reliant on just one textbook, not mentioning any names, with 2 authors, but this is one of the most established of the English language textbooks in archaeology, and it does an amazing job. So, I mean, I'd love to hear more about how that happened. How did you get involved? I mean, it makes sense given your interests, and but tell us what happened. How did this come about?
Well, I think so. When Kevin first did his first iteration of it it's 1983 or 1984, I should know that. And when he first did that, he was teaching, I think, an adult education class about archaeology, and so the book sort of came from his teaching, and his teaching notes sort of there wasn't a book like it at the time, and it was really useful for his students, and so it sort of emerged from that. And then subsequently, he's been at the University of Newcastle and is now an emeritus professor, and has retired. And I think he did the first 4 editions himself, and they got more and more complex. And so he in the 3rd and 4th edition had web companions and things like that as well, before those kind of things had really been invented. So really cool cutting edge stuff. But I think as he had a large sort of piece of research to do and things, and so when it got to the 5th edition, Tom Moore came on board to sort of assist in sort of refreshing it and bringing it up to date. And I think they were conscious that was the 5th edition was 2010, so it still made references to CD-ROMs, which I don't know, I mean, whether people who watch this even will remember what a CD-ROM is, or have ever been aware of them. But so it sort of needed a lot of updating in regards to just the amazing developments that our profession has seen, particularly around the digital, but also around things like DNA and things like that as well. So huge changes that have happened, haven't been captured. And so now Kevin is retired, and Tom is head of department at the moment at the University of Durham, and so I think they were looking for someone to come on board, and I think my name was sort of thrown out there, and I put together some suggestions, and they brought me on board. But in my career, at the point where I sort of came on board, I was like, oh yes, this is really useful, and I've been teaching about fieldwork, and I've been using this book myself for teaching, so I can think about how it all sort of works together. And then literally the pandemic hit, and I was in a leadership role around e-learning, and had spent all the time before the pandemic saying to people, oh, do you want to do online learning? And then suddenly everyone needed to do online learning, so we were all sort of quite sort of busy in the general sort of writing of it all. So amazingly, we've written it between the three of us, but I only met Tom in person for the first time last week at the Society of American Archaeologists conference. And I've never met Kevin in person. So this is a book very much of the digital, because we've communicated constantly non-stop, but almost entirely in a digital way, so which is really amazing. But I think I've really come on board with a view to updating the kind of things that have happened that needed to be updated since, but also one of the major sort of, I think, fundamental changes that's happened since the last edition is that heritage as a space for critical consideration and our role as archaeologists in thinking about heritage has become much more refined, much more studied, and something that we're much more conscious of, and not just heritage, but the social value of our archaeology that we're doing. Yes. And so there's a whole new chapter about that, which is largely my doing. So if people think it's problematic, they can completely blame me for that. But I think the things like the Heritage Futures project that's going on, that's imagining who are we preserving heritage for, those kind of questions. You know, I talk to my students about those kind of things all the time, and I recognise that the book needed a bit of that going in. And also, obviously, theoretically, archaeology has had a huge sort of turn toward the material. So everything that we've been talking about in terms of funerary archaeology and bodies and those kind of sort of extended bodies across the landscape, the kind of theoretical frameworks to understand that have really developed since over the last 15 years. So capturing that as well has been sort of something that I took on board as well. So that's kind of the process.
Well, no one's asked me to pass judgment or write a book review of it, but from what I've dipped into so far, what I think is really important about this as a textbook is, you know, I'm learning stuff from it. Not that I didn't know about this stuff or wasn't aware of it, not like I'm living in a, but I was going, oh yeah, now that makes sense, you know, and if I can do that, then surely my students should be able to do. Different fingers and different pies, different things we're doing, but we're all constantly out of date. And if I can see it, just I'm dipping into it, I go, this is clearly an older section, but that's a good reminder. Oh yeah, I've been aware of those articles, I've skipped, but that's a nice synopsis of that topic. This is invaluable, particularly not only for my teaching and for my learning, but also for when I'm having to answer questions from randos on social media, which is what part of I'm doing. So I can say I would fully endorse this, and that's my one sort of, I must admit, not that I ever dismissed textbooks, but suddenly my appreciation of their value has just skyrocketed, particularly with, you know, in the last year. And this came along and I went, yeah, you know, so I can only say, well, hey, you know, great stuff. And yes, those new sections I think are really important, because there haven't, whether it's a textbook or not, I don't think there's been anything that's tried to, you know, doing a job. As I'm talking to people on trying to condense things into 3-minute or even 1-minute TikToks, or talk, you know, when you're talking on radio, trying to synopsize and really point a point into something, you know, it's a near impossible task, but it's a real challenge, and the skill of doing. I have all my respect for those that write these things, and for you and what you've done with this one, and for what has already been achieved with the earlier iterations. You know, is just elevated so much. You know, it's not, as I said, I'm not saying I dismissed them at any point, but it's just like thinking through the nitty gritty of how would I have done that. And I don't, so many points ago, I know about that stuff, but I can say it to students in half an hour, but could I have said it in 3 sentences? Or, you know, it's a really different challenge. So well done. You know?
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, I think you're right. And I think that kind of summing up of things is in a way that's got enough depth but isn't too much depth.
No.
But yeah, it's a real challenge. I think I've proved from our conversations today that I'm a bit of a waffler, so that's one of the things I've really benefited from working with Kevin and Tom, who've basically gone, can this be condensed? To inform my learning, to teach, and then to inform my teaching, and to think about how students can use them to get the best understanding of whatever we're doing in that moment. But the thing that I've been thinking about recently is now the sixth edition is out, how do we step that up? I think, because actually I think there hasn't been any work on this anywhere as far as I can see, but I think the 21st century demands something different of a textbook now. I think the thing that I kept when I was doing the sixth edition of Archaeology and Introduction, the thing that I kept coming back to was, everything we do is enmeshed in a digital world, and there's so many amazing resources out there, and in a textbook it's this static thing. And I don't want to make things like Kevin's amazing web resources and web companions. All the publishers have moved on from those now, because you don't need them, because you can get all the textbooks online, so you don't need a web companion. Yeah. But how do we connect a textbook with incredible digital resources that students can go and search for themselves? That's something I want to think about for the next edition in a lot more detail. That's where I think we can perhaps push ourselves and get so that students can go, oh, there is this thing, I can do this primary research myself now, so that they both get the summary and then they can leap off into something else. I think that's probably got to be a challenge of what we think about in terms of textbooks, but also something has changed. I think one of the things that's changed in terms of teaching and learning is that we don't just chalk and talk anymore, do we? That's the crucial thing. We don't just stand in front of our students and go, here's the facts, take the facts and go. We value our students' voices, and we value what our students have to say. We recognise that often our students bring something totally different to the interpretation that we might be missing. So how do we bring that into a textbook, I think, is something that I want to think about. So we had a bit of email correspondence before, and I'd cited some of your papers from student conferences, because I was just trying to think in that, how can we get students' voices into this? And at the moment, I think probably in the sixth edition, it's quite rudimentary the way I've done it. It's mostly just citations. There was some brilliant work that the Trailblazers team did in the pandemic with students from UCL, where they researched different women, and particularly women of colour in archaeology, and tried to sort of include that. I thought was really important, because it really recognised those kind of students' research as well. So I think that those in the sort of the next step for me in terms of thinking about textbooks is, how do we sort of really reach out into digital world? How do we really embed student voices? Those feel like the kind of next challenges for me. So that's for the seventh edition. That's what I want to think about how we do. I don't think I've got the answers yet, because the sixth edition has only just come out, but I've got a bit of time to think about it, I think. So
it's great to hear that you're already thinking of the next step. I have lots of opinions but no solutions, but I won't rant you about them here, but I have lots of thoughts on what I found hasn't worked for me and what does work for me in terms of and the broader frustrations. Because I mean, just one of the things that I find really difficult at the moment for me in my public engagement is how out of step, well, obviously there's a drag of established knowledge out there, but how our popular books, not textbooks here, I'm talking other kinds of media, are simply not fit for purpose for what the broader scale and character of misinformation / actually our information, but distorted down weird routes. So it's almost something I could have said and half remembered, half heard, and then it's coming back to us on a feedback loop from pop culture and going, hang on, and so I'm in my period of discipline. I've literally last week read an introduction to a brand new book on a particular subject I will not mention, and just was shocked. Not how bad it was. It was good, well, scholarly written, it's publicly engaged, it's synthetic, and yet within the first 2 pages, I can identify 3 massive, in modern parlance, red flags that are just going to be taken and already perpetuating some really dangerous misinformation out there. And that's no fault of the author. It's just the fact that I still think we're working with too much, that ivory tower cliche. We may be thinking of students, but I don't think we're realizing just how much people are picking up stuff from these authoritative contexts and running with it in all manner of scary directions. And I'm too guilty of having in the past realizing, oh, that's just crazy stuff, that's nothing to do with me. But then actually at almost every turn it's there. Mess of our own making is coming back to haunt us, particularly in the early historic periods that I deal with, where it really, it's 2000 years, 1500 years ago, but this stuff matters to people in all manner of ways that perhaps it shouldn't, but it does. And it really, so anyway, I'd love to hear how this develops. I think you're absolutely right, that connecting in student voices, that connecting in the digital has to be somehow a direction.
And I agree, I totally agree, and it's something that I've thought about all the way through. So things like, like I mentioned before, DNA is one of the big things that's changed. But then how do you need to talk about the kind of factual developments that have happened, but you also need to say, and this can be used in really dangerous, really sort of reductive, really racist ways. And so we have to guard against it. So every section in the book that mentions DNA also has things like that. And I think that's where a textbook is a really interesting thing, because you are imparting fact, but you're also having to give that kind of context, that kind of container of caveats, that we can't take this in this way, that we have to, that some uncertainties are right, because otherwise we're straying into sort of territories that can be really problematic. And so and I think that's something that maybe you asked earlier on, like what's changed in teaching and learning in archaeology. And I wonder if one of the things that's changed is that perhaps we're more confident in our teaching in saying this isn't the facts. When people did their archaeology degrees maybe sort of 40 years ago or so, there was facts, and now, and particularly because we can bring our students' voices in, we can say, well, look at this range of interpretive things that are happening in the classroom right here. So we need to sort of interrogate very carefully that there's sort of multiple approaches. And I think that maybe that is one of the things we've become more confident as teachers to say that, and building that into kind of textbooks, I think it's probably a really important thing, I think. So
watch this space. It sounds like you're not only your work to date, but you're going to be still driving forward on the teaching and the research side, a whole series of important innovations we all need to keep an eye out for and reflect on. But I want to sort of not conclude, but sort of say you a final sort of area. Is there any thoughts you have on how we do better with particularly sensitive topics that archaeologists might address? And we've already touched on a few of them, whether it's death or misuse by for particularly pernicious narratives. But do you have any other areas that you think we, in our teaching and our research, we need to collectively do better about, do you think, Hannah, moving forward?
Oh my gosh,
everything probably.
So one of the things that I've not talked about at all in any of our conversation so far is the work that I've been involved in around equity and inclusion in archaeology.
Right. Yes.
And so I've done various studies of the kind of diversity of our students across British archaeology, and how that doesn't match up with our profession, with the statistics around our profession. So we've obviously got really diverse students, but not a very diverse profession, and so there must be some barriers there. So how can we sort of address those kind of barriers? And I've also obviously in the UK we've got the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, and I founded and chaired their Equality and Diversity special interest group in 2015, and that's now sort of transformed into a standing committee for equity and inclusion, and that's been a really, I've learned so much from that process. And I think when it comes to sensitive topics, when it comes to things that are difficult, it feels to me like the answer is to be honest and to be your authentic self, and to recognize your own privilege. We often come to these kind of things with so much privilege and so much baggage, and if you can be honest about that, and then not be afraid to ask questions, and then if somebody says that question is inappropriate, to then say, oh, I've learned from that, I'm sorry that I phrased that wrong, what's the best way that we can talk through this difficult issue? So I think coming to things that are with honesty and with authenticity and with a recognition of and attempt to challenge one's own privilege, I think those are probably my thoughts about how we deal with those kind of difficult things, because rather than swerving them or brushing them under the carpet or pretending they don't happen or being antagonistic, none of those things are helpful in addressing and getting over or addressing difficult issues. Whereas having a conversation and being honest about it, I think, is probably the best thing. That's
a really good point, obviously, and in terms of individual responsibilities, which we all have to reflect on what we've done in the past, how we teach, how we research, how we interact with other colleagues, students, and how we try to achieve but how do you how does that work across the professional and academic spheres? How do we have those conversations better, do you think? I mean, maybe that's a different aspect to it, isn't it?
I don't know, and I think in a way this also loops back to what we were talking about kind of materials and personhood and things. We probably need to talk about those kind of things. So I'm a trustee for the Enabled Archaeology Foundation, which is a fantastic charity which supports archaeologists with disabilities, and it is a really, a lot of the kind of things that my colleagues in the Enabled Archaeology Foundation are talking about are the kind of systemic changes that need to happen in terms of thinking about how we make things accessible from the start, not making specific adjustments from individual people, but starting out in that way. But you can't have those kind of conversations without those kind of honest and authentic conversations, so that people understand, well, people with all of these different disabilities are experiencing these things in these kind of ways, and also other sort of systemic structural changes, again, I think stem from a degree of that kind of authenticity. For example, I think one of the most amazing things that happened, but just before the pandemic, there is a fantastic group called Mentoring Women in Archaeology and Heritage. And it's for anyone who identifies as women or non-binary people. And it's a Facebook group, and it's a lovely support group. And from that, a lot of people recognised that the experiences of being on archaeological sites and having menstruating bodies were horrific, because one of the easy ways to make your job win the tender, to make it cheaper, is not to have as many toilets, or to not sort of have kind of the welfare provision. And their Seeing Red campaign not only sort of advocated that those kind of welfare provisions be made, because at the moment there are more women than there are men in sort of in the early career parts of field archaeology, so they're in the field doing the digging, but also having things like period packs as standard. So you have your first aid kit, and then you have a period pack that has got all the kind of things that might be needed, so sanitary towels and tampons and wipes and all of those kind of things in a bag, in a pack, in any toilet, so that they are there, so that you're making that kind of adjustment from the start. And I think I should sort of say, I don't think that everybody who is having I don't think people should have to personally disclose disabilities or things that are happening with their bodies or things that need adjustments. I think we all need to be talking about those. But because people have started these conversations, there is space for that kind of structural change, because people have very carefully and really thoughtfully put themselves out there. So now we can build on that and make that kind of structural change.
I'm don't claim any expertise or insight into that, but I was just thinking about an analogy was some public talks I've given where I don't know who's in the audience, right? And I don't know what their backgrounds are, and I'll make up a scenario, but I have talked about some very sensitive topics, and then at the end some old lady or some young chap has come up and said, actually that's happened in my family, and this is what the background's, and you realize that your talk has touched on them. And it's just about showing a duty of care and responsibility to you may be talking about subjects or entering into spaces where people need certain requirements, and the way I presented it, I think in that instance was a success, because they came up to me and divulged that. But they might not talk about those issues if I'd closed it down with insensitive language or sensitive, discussions of a particular issue. And that's not the same thing as practical provisions in fieldwork, but it's about everything we do has to be sort of, I suppose, have those conversations. So you're going into that with some kind of inclusive way you talk, the way you frame things, so that it's not an issue, so people do feel they can then volunteer their information. And if you don't, the problem is, if I didn't do that, and I probably don't do it all the time well, you're never going to hear the people who feel like, I don't really want to talk about this anymore, I don't want to ask a question, or I don't want to go on with this kind of project or this kind of degree. And I think we don't realize how many people we're losing from the profession, from our conversations with the public, with students, because of the way we are. I don't know, probably not related, but it just seems to me that it's the practical provisions and the way in which we're framing archaeology needs to fundamentally be more inclusive.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, there's been such a furore about woke archaeology after Kemi Badenoch talked about it in Parliament. But I feel like, from my perspective, thinking about others and thinking about and attending to care for others in the way that we work, and making space for inclusion, has to be the way that archaeology shapes itself. Otherwise, like you say, we cut out the conversation, we cut people out from the conversation almost immediately. And we need for our profession to continue, we're so valuable as a profession, we do so much stuff, and we need to sort of continue those kind of conversations. So making sure that we don't shut those conversations down from the very start is so important. And so for me, the idea that there could be such a thing as woke archaeology seems daft, because I think all archaeology should be working on the principles of kindness and inclusion. And then that's the way that we sort of take the profession forward, and the way that we include our students, and the way that we work really in a collegiate way with one another. Yeah, I feel really proud of the way that we do this already. Yesterday, I was at an event about history careers, and my historian colleagues were talking about how they felt that sort of as historian academics, they were very isolated. It was a real sort of isolated, singular career, where you had to write a book, you had to do all of this kind of stuff in your head on your own. And I thought, gosh, archaeologists are so different. We're so collaborative, because we have to be, because we work in the field with each other, and we work in labs with each other, and we're a small discipline. And I think that kind of collaborative nature with our students and with one another and with the public and the wider world is such a lovely thing. I think we should champion it and grow it, because it's such an important part of archaeology. Anyway, I'm waffling on now.
No, I mean, it's just inspiring and insightful, and I'm just so in awe and impressed by all your achievements and where you're driving this forward. It's brilliant, Hannah. So I just want to say, unless you have any final thoughts for us, I think we've covered most of the areas, at least signposted, and there will be in the description links to all of the projects that Hannah's been working on, some key publications, or at least your website, and but so people can get that information and follow it up, so the enable archaeology and all that. But is there any final thoughts you have for us, if that's not too difficult a challenge to put to you?
I don't know. I feel like we've covered so much, haven't we? We've covered so much in this conversation, which is also, I mean, I feel like I almost feel like a bit emotional, because I think the thing about archaeology is that we're all so passionate about what we do, aren't we? Yeah. All archaeologists, from our students to anyone who is a sort of volunteer or works in a community group, to academics, we're so passionate about what we do. And that connectedness with the material things, with sort of thinking about life and death, and sort of thinking about how we make space for multiple voices in what we do, that's woven through all of the conversations we've had, and that's today. And that's because as archaeologists, it weaves through what we think, and I think that is a wonderful thing. I really celebrate it, and that's the kind of archaeology that I want to be part of for the rest of my career, I think. So
I'm quite sure you're going to make it happen, and you are making it happen. But thank you, Hannah. It's been absolutely excellent, and just good luck with all you do moving forward. And I hope we get a chance to chat again and scheme about some more of these issues. Thank
yeah,
you.
oh yeah, definitely. Thank you. Brilliant.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.